Welcome. My name is Bill Federer, and today we're going to talk about political Islam. You know, we see news of churches in Egypt being blown up and Christians being killed. And in Iraq, the Christians, the Chaldean Christians, an ancient sect, has existed for centuries. About 1% of Iraqis are Christian, but yet they make up about 40% of the refugees leaving Iraq. And then we look at the Holy Land. And Bethlehem has been going from a Christian community to a Muslim community. And they were firing on the church there, the church right there in Bethlehem, and Muslims taking over. And we keep asking ourselves, what's going on? Now, there are lots of moderate Muslims, and we're not so much concerned about them because they're not a threat. But the ones that are doing violence, there has to be some thoughts that are in their mind that are motivating them. And we are concerned because we don't like seeing violence and innocent people being hurt. And so we want to get an insight into the mind of those that are promoting a political and military Islamic agenda. You know, there's freedom for all religions in America. And we're very proud of the fact that there's freedom for all religions in America. But there's a question. Is Islam just a religion? Well, to answer that question, we have to ask, who was the perfect Muslim? Who was the one that all the current Muslims are striving to be like? Well, that was Muhammad. Muhammad was the perfect Muslim. And so, if we study his life, we get an insight into those that are wanting to follow his example. And so we look at Muhammad's life. It's very fascinating. It went through 3 stages. Muhammad was a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca for 12 years. Mecca in Arabia had over 360 different pagan gods. They had a square building called the Kaaba, and in there were housed all these idols, and the pagans would worship there. And so they were very tolerant in Mecca, and they would get along with the differences, and they actually had 1 month off where they agreed not to fight, and they would all go on pilgrimage there. And so Muhammad, for 12 years, was in this city, and he was trying to make converts. He was not very successful. By many records, he only made about 70 converts in 12 years. It was a frustrating time for him. And then his uncle dies, Abu Talib, who was his protector. And when Abu Talib died is when the pagans in Mecca began to get a little frustrated with Muhammad. He got new verses from Allah telling him to warn the infidel of judgment. And so he hangs around this Kaaba, this square building, and he's disrupting their pagan worship services and telling them that they're going to burn in hell and all their ancestors are burning in hell. And so the pagans view this as disrupting the peace of their city. And so they chased Muhammad out of the city in the year 622 AD. And so this is year 1 in the Muslim calendar, 622 AD. This is the flight, the Hijra. So Christians and Western civilization, our year 1 is the year Jesus was born, or the best we can figure that. And the Muslims' year 1 is 622 AD, the flight, the Hijra, when Muhammad was chased out of Mecca and he fled to Medina. Now, Medina was a Jewish city 210 miles north of Mecca. 3 Jewish tribes controlled Medina, and they let Muhammad in as a religious refugee, as an immigrant. And Muhammad comes in, he presents his faith to the Jews, and the Jews reject him. And they said, you're not a prophet in the line of our Jewish prophets. And so Muhammad changes the direction of bowing from Jerusalem to Mecca. That's right, he originally had his followers bowing toward Jerusalem. But when the Jews rejected him, he goes into the pagan neighborhoods in Medina, and he bows toward their city of Mecca. And so here he is in these pagan neighborhoods making converts. And a few pagan leaders resist him, and they mysteriously get assassinated. And so the rest of the pagans figure they better join Muhammad. And so now he's got a power base, he has a following, he's sort of acting like a community organizer in this minority neighborhood. He goes back to the Jewish leaders, and he presents himself as a candidate of change. He said, look, I'm a newcomer to this city. I can rise above the partisanship where these different tribes didn't get along for centuries. And so the Jews make a treaty with Muhammad, and he becomes a political leader in Medina. And so now he's a religious leader and he's a political leader. Then something happens. Muhammad's followers back in Mecca, they get a little belligerent and confrontational and argumentative, the way some of his followers are today, and they disrupt the peace of the city and they get chased out. And they flee north to Medina, where Muhammad is a political and religious leader. And they're led in to Medina, and Muhammad permits them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing him out of town. And so he had a whole chapter of the Quran, Surah 8, chapter 8, on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. And so we can begin to see a little difference between this and Christianity, where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt. Muhammad taught, if they take your house, you take their caravan. And so Muhammad had 300 warriors, and they would rob the caravans. And there's verses where he would send them out with a blessing and then remind them not to rob from the booty. Now, his portion was a fifth of the booty. Well, the Meccans in the year 624 AD decide to send 1,000 soldiers to Medina to protect their caravan as it went past that city. And Muhammad, with 300 warriors, defeats them at the Battle of Badr. And so this is an amazing victory where Muhammad was outnumbered 3-1. The Battle of Badr in 624 AD. And Muhammad takes this amazing victory, again, having been outnumbered 3-1, as confirmation that his Allah wants him to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He leads 27 of them. And Muhammad even used the catapult when he attacked the city of Al-Taif. And when he was told the catapult was killing women and children, Muhammad's response was, they are among them. So they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers today say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did when he used the catapults. And since Muhammad is the perfect Muslim, Muslims that want to imitate him religiously, politically, and then militarily. And so we begin to see that this is something that we in the West are not used to understanding. Well, in the year 627 AD, the Meccans, the pagan city of Mecca, has their last-ditch effort to try to stop these caravans from being robbed. Their economy is really hurting. And so they get a coalition force of Jews, nomads, different pagan tribes, and they march toward Medina. Now, Muhammad was a religious leader and only made 70 converts in 12 years. That's nothing really outstanding. He was a political leader, and he was brilliant and able to understand the different politics and so forth of the city. But he was an unbelievable military leader. He was a genius militarily. One of the reasons was he did not play by the traditional rules of warfare in Arabia. For example, the pagans had 1 month off where they agreed not to fight. It was their Ramadan pilgrimage month. Well, Muhammad got verses from Allah on allowing him to rob the caravans during this month, and he caught them totally by surprise. Well, Muhammad's version of roadside bombs, or IEDs, was he dug potholes and trenches all around the city of Medina, which rendered their superior cavalry useless. In other words, you can't charge your horses and camels across a field full of potholes and trenches while you're being shot at. They'll break their legs. And so Muhammad, this battle strategy worked, and it caused the Meccans to be confounded. And so they hesitate because of all these potholes and trenches that are dug around the city of Medina. And so Muhammad goes to some of the tribes and bribes them, and they leave in the night. He threatens some of the other tribes, and they leave in the night. Somebody that may be familiar with Chicago politics, the idea of the bribe or the bullet. You know, you flatter or you use fear. And so finally, there's just a number of Meccans left, a couple thousand, and it gets freezing cold for a week. And these Meccans lose heart and decide to bring their troops home. And when they retreat and withdraw and bring their troops home, Muhammad considered this a great victory, that his enemies showed cowardice, and this emboldened him. He goes back into the city of Medina, and there were these 3 Jewish tribes, remember, that let him in 5 years earlier. He gets offended at one of the Jewish tribes, confiscates their property, and chases them out of town. He gets offended at a second Jewish tribe, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. This actually set a precedent in Islam called hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So remember when he first came to this city of Medina, and the Jews let him in, and he goes into the minority neighborhoods and organizes, and then he becomes a political leader and makes a treaty with the Jews. Now it's 5 years later, and he's got a victory under his belt of having chased off these 10,000 Meccans. And so he breaks the treaty with two of the tribes and feels he's justified in doing that, and confiscates their property and chases them out of town. Again, this is a precedent in Islam called hudna. That is, when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So here we're facing a dilemma. We're pressuring Israel to make a treaty with the surrounding Muslim nations, but their concept of treaty is this temporary ceasefire from hostilities that you prepare for the next battle. Well, that third Jewish tribe in Medina, Muhammad bottles them in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they finally surrender, he brings them into the market of Medina and chops off their heads. There were 600 or 700 of them, and then he sells the women and children into slavery. And slavery was the number one way that Islam was financed for nearly 1,400 years. In the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam and the United States, there are excerpts from the Surat, the biography of Muhammad, and it talks about how he treated these third Jewish tribe in that city of Medina. And he captures these Jews, and they ask what they think is going to be done with them. And their leader says, "Don't you understand? The summoner never stops. Those who are taken away do not return. By Allah is death." Goes on to say that Zohair, an aged Jew who had saved some of Muhammad's allies, was interceded for and granted a pardon. But he said, "What has become of other Jewish chiefs?" And he was told they were slain already. And he said, "What use is life to me? Slay me also, that I may join those who have preceded me." When this was told to Muhammad, he said, "Yea, he shall join them in the fire of hell," and he too was beheaded. And so this began Muhammad's military career, and by the time he died, nearly all of Arabia was conquered. He conquered Yemen. Yemen was a Jewish kingdom for centuries. Yemen's in the news today. He conquered the Ghassanids. These were Arab Christians. People say, Arab Christians? Yes, there was a thriving Arab Christian community that Muhammad conquered. And so he came to this Jewish city as an immigrant, and then he increased the number of his followers, and then he eliminated the Jews. So 5 years after coming to a Jewish city, there was not a Jew left in the city. We're going to be right back, and we're going to examine how this pattern is still being used today. There are lots of moderate Muslims, but we're not talking about them. They're no threat. But there are Muslims that do have an agenda, and our headlines are filled almost every day with some type of violence, and we're wanting to understand what's going on in their mind. And so we're beginning to look at Muhammad's life. Muhammad's life provides a blueprint, and we see that he went from a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader. And in another way of looking at it, there's 3 steps. You know, Caesar had his 3 steps: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's was he immigrated to the Jewish city of Medina, and then he increased the number of his followers in the minority pagan neighborhoods, and then he eliminated. 5 years after coming into a Jewish city, there was not a Jew left in the city. And so we see this process of immigrating, increasing, and eliminating is a pattern that's actually been used for nearly 1,400 years. And we see huge areas of the world that used to be Christian, used to be Jewish, and were taken over and are now Muslim. Egypt had been Christian for 6 centuries. The church in Egypt was started by Mark, that wrote the gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when the Muslims invaded under Amir ibn al-As, is when they had to smuggle the bones of Mark out of the country by packing them under pork. They actually shipped them to Venice, Italy, and that's where St. Mark's Cathedral, where his bones were kept. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century, and they were all conquered by the Muslims. Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia. Tunisia used to be Carthage, where St. Augustine was from. Libya, Tripoli, those were all Christian and Catholic countries. And then Spain was invaded by the Muslims in the year 711. And they had the stirrup and fought on horseback, and so this was a military advantage where the Europeans were still on foot and fighting with heavy metal swords. So in 10 years, the Muslims conquered all of Spain. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Then they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and they conquered all of southern France. And then Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight should join Charles Martel. Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And Charles Martel gets about 30,000 volunteers. This happens to be the largest army in Europe at the time. You could go all the way to Poland, and there was not another 30,000-man army in Europe. So if Charles Martel was not successful in stopping the Islamic invasion, all of Europe would have been conquered, and we would be speaking Arabic right now, because German, French, and English would have never developed as languages. We would be like Egypt, where the Caliph Umar and his general Amir ibn al-As, when they came into Egypt, they cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking Egyptian. That's why they speak Arabic in Egypt today. And so this is what would have happened in Europe. But they were finally stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD by Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. So Muhammad dies in 632 AD in Arabia. By 732 AD, the Muslims are outside of Paris. And interesting battle. The leader, Charles Martel, puts his men on top of a hill in a square. And again, they're all on foot, and they all have axes, and you know, they're just off the farm. And so the Muslim commander, Abdul Rahman, orders a charge. And his men can't get at a full gallop charging uphill through trees. And from their vantage point, it looks like it's just a line, and they would charge right into the line, but it's a square, 30,000 men in one square. And so they would go in and get stuck. And meanwhile, Charles Martel had prearranged for some of his men to sneak into the Muslim camp and free the captives. And so the Muslim warriors began to see their booty being let go. Muhammad said you can have 4 wives plus as many as your right hand possesses, as many as you take in battle. So you could have 4 women that have the status of a wife, but you could have lots of other women. And the Sultan always got a 5th. Many sultans had 1,000 wives. One sultan had 12,000 wives. Anyway, as the warriors saw their booty being let go from the camp, they would leave the fight. And the commander, Abdul Rahman, tries to rally his warriors back, and he gets distracted, surrounded, and killed. And now the Muslims cannot decide who their next commander is going to be, and so they pick up and they go back to Spain. That was the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. And so Charles Martel got every horse he could find, learned how to make a stirrup, and 5 years later began to win his first battle. And when the Europeans came up to military par equivalency and they learned how to use the horse and the stirrup, they began to win battles. And it took 700 years to drive the Muslims out of Spain. They finally did in 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, forcing the Muslim leader in Granada to surrender. Well, the Muslims then conquered Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been a Christian city for 3 centuries, since Constantine. His mother, St. Helena, went down to the Holy Land and sought out the places where Christ's passion took place and built big cathedrals. And so for 3 centuries, Jerusalem was a Byzantine Christian city. And then the Muslims conquered Syria. Syria was the first country to completely be Christian in 265 AD. There's actually more ancient Christian writings in the Syrian language than any other language other than Greek and Latin. And so that was all the first wave of Islamic expansion. It went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. It was called the Umayyad Muslim Empire, and it was the largest empire in the world at the time. The ancient, crippled Byzantine Empire was crumbling, and the rest of Europe was too unorganized. You had Clovis, who converted the Franks to Catholicism, to Christianity, and he started the Merovingian dynasty. And then it was Charles, that started the Carolingian dynasty, and that was Charlemagne. And so we see that this first wave of Islamic expansion was explosive. In 100 years, they were unstoppable. One of the reasons was, and Teddy Roosevelt brings this out, Teddy Roosevelt said in 1916, He said the Christians of Asia and Africa had trained themselves not to fight, whereas the Muslims were trained to fight. He says Christianity was saved in Europe simply because the Europeans fought. And so we see that you think, well, how can Christians fight? Well, it's a defensive thing. It's what does a Christian policeman do when he sees a criminal about to rape and murder somebody? Does he say, oh, I'm a Christian and you're a criminal, I forgive you, go your way? He says, no, we're supposed to defend the innocent, rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to death. That's the verse that gives the energy to the pro-life movement, that we're supposed to rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to death. And so it's not forcing them to convert, it's protecting the innocent, defend the orphan and the widow. Anyway, so here was the defense of Europe, and that was the first wave of Islamic expansion. Then there's the second wave. Now, why are we studying this? Well, again, there's thoughts that are in the minds of Muslims today. Not all of them, lots of them, the majority of them are moderate, but the ones that are doing the violence, there is something motivating them, and they see themselves following in the example of these rightly guided caliphs. There is a religious, a political, and a military aspect that's all combined into one. Well, then there's Genghis Khan, the Mongolian, and he kills 30 million people and conquers from Korea to Hungary, Moscow down to India. And in the next century, one of the Mongolian tribes converts to Islam, the Turkish Mongols, or the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. This begins the second wave of Islamic expansion. And the Turkish Muslims invade the Byzantine Empire. Now today that's called Turkey, but back then it was all Christian. This is where Antioch and Galatia and Colossae and all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation. This is where the Apostle Paul and the Apostle John preached. And so the Muslims invaded, and they would turn churches into mosques. They would take the church bells, melt them into cannons, and they would dig up the bones of the Christian saints and give them to the dogs. Their first battle was 1071, and in the year 1087 is when the Christians there in the area of Turkey moved the bones of their most famous saint to Italy. Who was the most famous saint in the Greek Orthodox world? Saint Nicholas. He lived during Roman times. He was generous and gave to the poor. And when they had the Council of Nicaea, tradition is that he slapped Arius for starting the Arian heresy, the first heresy that split Christianity. And then Nicholas was imprisoned under the Roman Emperor Diocletian previously. And then Nicholas preached against paganism and they tore down the temple to Diana. So he was a very vocal, very strong Christian leader, and he was generous. And so the Christians in Greece and Turkey would give gifts on the anniversary of his death, December 6th. Well, when the Muslims invaded, they would turn churches into mosques and dig up the bones of the Christian saints and give them to the dogs. And so that's when, in 1087, the bones of Saint Nicholas were moved over to Italy. Little town in southeast Italy called Bari, B-A-R-I. And so this introduced him to Western Europe, and eventually the traditions got mixed together with Christmas celebrations, and it was the Dutch that brought the St. Nicholas traditions to New York, and they pronounced it Sant Nicolaas or Santa Claus. So we would not have a Santa Claus over here had it not been for a jihad back in 1087 there in Asia Minor. Well, as the Muslims invaded, the Byzantine Empire cries out to the West for help. Now you have to understand, the Byzantine Empire viewed itself as the true Christians, and they viewed the Latin Catholic West as the church split. And so it was a big humbling of their pride to beg the West for help. Now, the East and West split about 40 years earlier at the Great Schism in 1054, and it was over 2 words in the Nicene Creed. It was of the Son. In other words, in the West, we believe the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Yet in their area, they said the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. And it was over that was the final straw that split the East and the West. And so it was a big humbling of the East's pride to beg the West for help. And Alexis Comnenus was the Byzantine emperor. And over there, the Byzantine emperor was also the head of the Byzantine church. So they had no separation of church and state there. And so he begs the West for help, Pope Urban II, and gets the plea, and Pope Urban II responds, again, with this attitude of, let's set aside the religious differences, let's come to the aid of these Byzantine Christians to protect the innocent, rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to death, protect the flock as a good shepherd. And so he goes to the Council of Clermont, and he presents the cause. And he talks about the letters that he has gotten where the Muslims, the Saracens, would force the Christians to extend their necks and then with a single stroke of a naked sword decapitate them. And so finally the European monarchs respond and they send the First Crusade in 1095. It takes back Jerusalem for 100 years. And then the Muslims begin to rally and drive the Christians out. And then there's the Second Crusade, Third, Fourth, Fifth, about 9 major crusades in a 200-year period. We're all familiar with who led the Third Crusade. It was King Richard the Lionheart, and he led his brother King John in charge of England while he was on the crusade. And we know that story because King John had raised the taxes, and there was Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood, and then later King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. So that was the Third Crusade. And I'm recording this program in St. Louis, Missouri. And St. Louis was King Louis IX. He was the King of France, very pious, and he led the 7th and 8th Crusades. He came to the rescue of the Christians in Egypt, trying to rescue them. But he was lured too far, and they broke the levee of the Nile, and it flooded his army. But fascinating history. So there's the first wave of Islamic expansion, then the second wave. We're going to be right back and finish with this talk on political and military Islam. You know, Muhammad and Jesus compared is an interesting comparison. The largest religion in the world is Christianity. Out of 6 or 7 billion people, they estimate about 2.2 billion are Christian. And the largest group of those are Catholic. 1.1 billion people are Catholic. And 80,000 people a day convert to Christianity every day. About 30,000 convert to Catholicism every day. And most of it is in Africa, Asia, and China. Christianity is dying in Europe, and it's barely holding its own in North America. And over 500 people are martyred every day for Christianity. Over 500 are killed every day for their Christian faith. And most of that is in Africa, Asia, and China. So in the same places where it's growing is the same places where the violence is the worst. And we see that the second largest religion is Islam, 22% of the world. So 33% is Christian, 22% is Muslim. And we're all worshiping the same God. Are we? Well, we want to worship the same God, but God has characteristics. And so we can see that if we do a little comparison, there's some differences that are worth noting. Jesus never killed anybody. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people, including cutting off the heads of those 700 Jews in Medina. Jesus never, Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad got 1/5 of the slaves taken in battle. He even owned African slaves because he was Arab. Jesus never married. Muhammad had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives, slave wives, concubines. There's a verse in the Quran that says, Allah has given you the slave girls for your booty. Then lots of stories where Muhammad visits his adopted son, Zayd, and sees his wife Zanadab, and then Zayd has to divorce Zanadab so Muhammad could marry her, and I could go on. But Jesus never avenged insults. He's dying on the cross saying, Father, forgive him. Muhammad avenged insults. In 630 AD, when he finally conquers Mecca, there were a list of people that he ordered killed. 3 of them were Ibn Khattal and his 2 slave girls. Ibn Khattal had made up poems making fun of Muhammad. The 2 slave girls recited the poems. Muhammad was insulted, so he ordered them murdered. So where Jesus forgave insults, Muhammad avenged insults. Jesus never tortured anybody. When Muhammad conquered Khaybar, a Jewish city, it was actually an oasis with palm trees and a wall around it, and this is the last Jewish settlement in Arabia. In 628 AD, the Jewish chief Kinanan surrenders, but he refused to tell where the tribe's treasure was hidden out in the desert. Muhammad had him stretched out on the ground, and they kindled a fire on his chest. He still wouldn't tell, so Muhammad had him beheaded, and then took his pretty 20-year-old wife, Sufyana, and put his mantle around her to signify she would be part of his booty, and slept with her that night. So Jesus never tortured anybody. Muhammad did. Jesus forgave insults, and Jesus also did not force anybody to follow him. Remember, Jesus said something difficult. Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no part in me. And it says in the Gospels that many disciples walked with him no more and said, this is a difficult saying, who can bear it? And Jesus turned to Peter and said, are you going to go too? And Peter said, where else can we go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. But Jesus was willing to let them go. Muhammad, in the Hadith, said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. So in other words, you're free to join, you can't leave. And so where Jesus let people leave if they wanted to, Muhammad wouldn't. Jesus was one who taught that God was our Father. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught that we're children of God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call yourself a child of Allah, because Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught that we're made in the image of God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to say you're made in the image of Allah, because Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. Go in the closet and pray, you and him. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah, because he's transcendent and unknowable. And so we can see these differences, and they're quite interesting. None of the apostles were governors or generals. Every one of the caliphs was a governor and a general. A caliph is the supreme leader in Islam after Muhammad died. We could go on and see the different comparisons. Jesus did not permit lying. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And Muhammad permitted lying to advance Islam. It's called taqiyya, sacred lying, holy deceit. You're obligated to lie if the goal is obligatory. And one story was Muhammad had a warrior who was captured, and he was forced to renounce Muhammad. He later escaped and went back to Muhammad, and Muhammad forgave him. And Muhammad said, if they make you turn, turn, but don't turn in your heart. In other words, it's okay to deny Muhammad in a pinch to save your skin, as long as you don't pick up arms and fight against Islam. In other words, it's okay to say you're not a Muslim in order to get elected, but then everything you do once you're elected is to help advance Islam. And so we see that it's okay for them to get on television and say something that is a lie if it can help advance Islam. And so there's two different sets of verses in the Quran. This is an interesting study. Muhammad lived in two cities, and he got verses from Allah while he was in those two cities. The first city he was in was Mecca, and so those verses are called Meccan verses, and they're a little more peaceful because he was just a religious leader during those 12 years. And then Muhammad goes to Medina, and the verses he gets there are called Medina verses, and they're more political and military. 2/3 of the Quran are political and military verses. And 41 times in the Quran it mentions the word jihad. Over 90% of those is political and military jihad. The 2% that or so that says it's to make yourself a better Muslim, the question is, who was the best Muslim? Well, it was Muhammad. Well, he was a political and military leader. So no matter which way you look at it, jihad does have a political and military conquest aspect to it. And so we begin to see a comparison based on these two cities. I use the example of the Bible. We have an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament has some violence in it. Moses wiping out tribes and David killing Goliath, right? And then there's the New Testament where Jesus and the apostles didn't kill anybody. And so what do we say? We're going to imitate the later ones, Jesus and the apostles. We want to do WWJD. What would Jesus do? And so the later verses supersede the earlier verses. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first. They're called weak verses, and they're superseded by the later verses it gets in Medina. They're called strong verses, and they're the political and military verses. And so the later verses supersede the earlier verses. And so fundamental Muslims that want to really try to follow Muhammad's example, they say, well, the last thing that he did and said is what we're going to follow. But so we see this comparison. Now, the idea of martyr in Jewish and Christian thought is, I'll not deny my faith even if you kill me. The idea of martyr in Islamic thought is it's dying while you're fighting in holy battles for Allah. In other words, it's dying while you're murdering, while you're killing somebody. And so in Judeo-Christian theology, one of the most dangerous spiritual places to be in is to die while you're committing a premeditated murder. In Islam, that's the only way to attain paradise, is to die while you're doing a premeditated, while you're killing somebody for Allah, and you die in the process. In Christian thought, believing Jesus is the Son of God is necessary to go to heaven. In Islamic thought, believing Jesus is the Son of God is an unforgivable sin called shirk, which condemns Muslims to hell. And so here, if we're worshiping the same God, how can the same God say if you believe in Jesus, you go up, and if you believe in Jesus, you go down? So we're either facing a situation where God's schizophrenic, or we're talking about two different gods. So God has characteristics. And by observing the characteristics of the Judeo-Christian God, where you love and do good to those that are not part of your group, you know, the Good Samaritan, and it's the love of God that brings men to repentance, and that we're all equal in the sight of God, and then the Islamic idea that says be ruthless to the unbeliever, to the infidel, and to, cut off the hand of a thief and so forth. So we see that God is identified by the characteristics. And the description of the characteristics in Islamic theology are different than God described in the Judeo-Christian theology. But we could go on and see that there is this comparison that does cause us to pause and think. And those that are wanting to imitate Muhammad see themselves as being faithful to their faith. Now, the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. And a Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And a faithful Muslim believes that there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So Islam is a religion of peace, but the definition of the word peace is different than our definition. Our definition of peace is different groups just learning how to get along. A faithful Muslim's definition of the word peace is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah, there's peace. In other words, there'll be world peace when there's world Islam. And people say, what about moderate Muslims? There's lots of moderate Muslims. There's lots of moderate Muslims. A moderate Muslim believes the world will submit to Allah later, maybe at the end of the world. Maybe it's even figurative. And since it's so far off in the distant future, just get along with the infidel, the kafir. That's fine. That type of Muslim just wants to live their life, and they want to have a family, and they're not really concerned about much of following Muhammad's example. They can live in a free democratic society just fine. The fundamental Muslim, on the other hand, thinks the world is submitting to Allah now, and they're really excited, and they actually want to help make it happen. Now, the dilemma for the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant of Islam, the more the moderate Muslim begins to rethink and say, wait a second, maybe the world is actually submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future peaceful moderate camp into the fundamental now camp, which is the violent camp. And so this is the dilemma that the West faces. The more we bend over backwards, thinking that if we can just show ourselves a little more tolerant, then they'll reciprocate and be peaceful, where in fact, from the fundamentalist point of view, the more we bend over backwards, it's encouraging and enthusiastically inspiring them that the day of the world submitting is even closer at hand, and that's when they gravitate from the peaceful future camp into the fundamental now camp, which happens to be the violent camp. Well, this is all in the book titled What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam and the United States. And fascinating study where we go back in history. Past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. There's lots of moderate Muslims, and we're thankful that there are moderate Muslims, and we want to encourage that. But we see news headlines of violence taking place of radical Muslims. Ivory Coast. had a Christian president, and he had been voted out, and Muslims were wanting to take over the Christian areas. And they got an army together and they killed over 1,000 Christians. And about 30,000 Christians in Ivory Coast boarded themselves up in a Catholic church compound of St. Teresa's. And 200 UN soldiers stood by and let it happen. And the United States actually was supporting the new Muslim leader of Ivory Coast. And so we see these headlines and we're wondering what's going on. Well, those that commit violence, they have thoughts in their minds. And what are their thoughts? In their mind, they think they are imitating the rightly guided caliphs and carrying on the tradition of 1,400 years of amazing military conquest that Muslims have had. Where in the first century of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to just outside of Paris. And then in the second wave of Islamic expansion, the Turks, they conquered all of what is today Turkey and then invaded Austria, surrounded Vienna twice, invaded parts of Poland, Wallachia, Moldova, Hungary. Large areas of Hungary were controlled by the Muslims. Matter of fact, it was Pope that sent San Juan Capistrano to Belgrade. And he was there in the city encouraging them when the Muslims are attacking. And here he is, 70 years old, and the Muslims are breaching the wall, and he holds up a cross and rallies the Christians, and they're able to repel the Muslim invasion. 3 times they conquered Belgrade. And you think, well, what are they doing up there? You know, well, this is a military conquest. And so this is part of their heritage. And so there's a religious heritage, but there's also a political and a military heritage. And it all in the fundamentalist mind is all sort of combined because Muhammad was a religious leader, but he was also a political and a military leader. You know, one of the things that we see when we look with a microscope at Muhammad's life and how he went through these 3 phases, Muhammad was a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca for 12 years until he's chased out of town. He goes to Medina and becomes a political leader, sort of like an organizer, right? And then he becomes a military leader and fights in 66 battles and raids. So this idea of religious, political, military, RPM, like on your car, the revolutions per minute, RPM. And so we look with a microscope and we see that he immigrates to this Jewish city of Medina when the Meccans chased him out. So he immigrates. And then he increases the number of his followers amongst the minorities in the city because the Jews control the city. And so he organizes them and becomes a political leader. And then he eliminates. And so he eliminates the Jews. And so 5 years after coming to the Jewish city, there's not a Jew left in the city. And so this pattern of immigrating, increasing, and eliminating is what we're seeing happen in Europe. So there's 700 neighborhoods around Paris that the police will not even protect you if you go in there. They're called zones. And the Muslims have completely taken them over. And you think, well, how did they do it? Well, the first ones came in as immigrants, and they were nice, and they were genuinely nice, and they don't see the whole picture. They just see their life, and they would rather come there and live under the freedoms. And people meet them, and people say, they're nice. I met a Muslim, they're really nice. And the response is, let more in. So more come in, and they get a community. And they get an imam who teaches them to follow the Quran closer. And they build a mosque and they start teaching to the women, start wearing the burqas and the veils and don't eat pork and don't be close friends with the infidels. And as the believers, the Christians and Jews in these neighborhoods and the secularists and the atheists, when they begin to see these veils and burqas appearing, they feel uncomfortable and they begin to move out. More Muslims move in. And that's when violence takes place, and there's no witnesses because no Muslim will testify against another Muslim on behalf of an infidel. That's part of Sharia law. And so they finally take over the neighborhoods. 700 neighborhoods around Paris, this has happened. Immigrating, increasing, and eliminating. And you may have seen the news clips and the videos on the internet of them blocking off streets and bowing in prayer during their prayer times, and the French police just stand around and let them. And so they're taking over, immigrating, increasing, and eliminating. The number 1 name given to newborns in London, England is Mohammed, and they're having on the average 8 kids per family. There's 50 million Muslims in Europe. At this rate, in 20 years, they'll have 100 million. And the Europeans, by the way, are having fewer kids plus abortion. And so they are allowing the immigrants to come in to supposedly help work jobs to pay the taxes to support all these social programs. It's interesting, every mosque teaches classes on how to sign up for welfare. And Muhammad said you can have 4 wives, and so these wives have lots of kids, and they all sign up for welfare. And in most of Western European countries, the largest segment drawing welfare are Muslim immigrants. And so we see Denmark, Norway, Sweden. The number 1 fastest growing crime is rape. Muslim immigrant men raping European women. Why? Muhammad permitted his men to rape the women they took in battle. And then we see Germany. 10 years ago, there were 3 mosques in Germany. Today, they're building 200. And 10% of Berlin is Turkish Muslim. I was there not too long ago, and you can't go anywhere without seeing Turkish Muslim women with their veils and their little boys, because Sharia law says that a woman cannot leave her house without a male relative, but a little boy will serve the purpose. And so over 100,000 Muslims gathered in a coliseum in Berlin, and the leader of Turkey comes up and tells them not to assimilate, don't learn the German language, they're there to take over. And so Angela Merkel, the president of Germany, said multiculturalism has failed. And she says you shouldn't come to Germany unless you're willing to learn their language and embrace the Christian ethic. That's what she mentioned. And so we're seeing this pattern of immigrating, increasing, and eliminating. And so in Holland, nearly all of southern Holland is Moroccan Muslim. And so we see this trend happening. And there's a lot of concern because once they come in, they pass laws, and these laws are called Sharia, and the laws allow men to beat their wives and allow them to divorce their wife simply by saying, I divorce you, and she's out the door with nothing, no alimony, no access to the kids. And so this is incompatible with our laws, especially in America, where we do not allow men to beat their wives. Yet in these different enclaves, Muslims are saying, look, it's sort of like spanking your kids that you do. We want to have the freedom to be able to spank our wives and beat them and so forth. It's interesting, some of the YouTube videos, they'll be interviewing an imam, and he'll say, in this way, Allah honors the woman. And the interviewer will say, well, how is this honoring the woman? And he says, Allah instructed not to beat the woman on the face, just elsewhere on her body. In this way, he is showing honor to the woman. Now, obviously, you and I would think that's not quite the way that we want it in America, yet this is Sharia law. And as they come in and have their communities, they immigrate, they increase, they eliminate, they take over neighborhoods, they begin to enact this in their own neighborhoods. And so we see that there is a difference going on. Now, I think it's interesting that we have the 3 aspects of Islam. We have a religious aspect, and then a political aspect, and then a military aspect. If we take the religion of Islam and set it on a shelf and say, we're not going to talk about the religion of Islam, bow any direction you want and believe you can have as many virgins in paradise as you want, that's your beliefs, that's private, that's yours. But wherever Muslims get in the majority, they pass laws called Sharia that govern every aspect of life of the people in that area. And then we see that there's a military aspect of Islam with 1,400 years of amazing military conquest all across the Mediterranean, and the Battle of Lepanto and the Battle of Tours and the Battle of Vienna and so forth. So we see this aspect that it's one word spelled I-S-L-A-M, Islam, but it has 3 meanings: religious, political, military. What's another way of explaining this? Well, let's look at the word light, L-I-G-H-T. What does that word mean, L-I-G-H-T? Light. Well, that's a source of illumination, like a lamp. Okay, that's a thing, that's a noun. But light also means it's a descriptive word. It's the opposite of the word heavy. Like light is a feather, heavy, light. Okay, so it's a noun, but it's also an adjective. But light is also a verb. Like you're going to light a match, light a stove, light a forest on fire. So light is one word spelled L-I-G-H-T with 3 meanings. It is a noun, an adjective, and a verb. Well, Islam is one word with 3 meanings. It is a religious system, a political system, and a military system. Now, the political and military ones want to present themselves as the religious side. In other words, the verb and the adjective want to present themselves as a noun. They want to take advantage of the freedoms that the noun has, yet they want to advance their adjective and their verb. So we're faced with a dilemma. that we don't have with other religions. And so this is the situation we're facing. So if we set the religion of Islam on a shelf for a moment and just examine political military Islam, we see that there are two large aspects. One, global conquest. And secondly, wherever they take over, non-Muslims are not treated with equality to Muslims. Christians and Jews are made into second-class citizens called dhimmi. You cannot pray out loud. It's actually the death penalty in Muslim countries like Arabia and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia to even try to witness to a Muslim and share your Christian faith. So dhimmi, so Muslims, fundamentalists have a global conquest aspect, and two, wherever they take over, non-adherents are not equal. Well, let's look for a second. In the last 70 years, what political military systems has the West and America had to face that, one, had a global conquest aspect to them, and two, wherever they took over, non-adherents were not equal? Well, let's see, maybe in the 1930s and 40s, maybe in Germany, the National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi, they had a global conquest aspect to them, and two, wherever they took over, non-Nazis like Jews were not equal. And so I'm half German, but in the 1930s we said we love the German, but we have to identify and stand against this political military system called Nazism. And we love the Japanese, but we had to identify and stand against Emperor Hirohito's imperialism. Why? He killed 100,000 in Nanking, China, and took over Korea and the Philippines. And we love the Italians, but we had to identify and stand against Mussolini's fascism. And we love the Russian, but we had to identify and stand against Soviet communism. Why? It had a global conquest aspect to it, and two, wherever it took over, non-communists were not equal. Well, today we love the Arab, we love the Indonesian, the Turk, the Somali, the Pakistani, the Egyptian, but we have to identify and stand against political and military Islam. Why? It has a global conquest aspect to it, and two, wherever it takes over, non-Muslims are not treated with equality. So we're not talking religion. We're bow any direction you want and believe you can have as many virgins in paradise as you want. Those are your beliefs. We're talking a political system that wherever they get in the majority, they pass laws that govern behavior of the citizens there. And it just so happens that these laws are totalitarian in aspect, governing your diet, what you eat, what you drink, the friends you have, what to pray and what direction to pray, how many wives you can have. These are political laws. And so we have a dilemma. In America, we believe in this concept called equality. There is no concept of equality in political Islam. Allah loves the Muslim who has submitted, and Allah hates the infidel who refuses to submit. And so women are not equal to men. And so this is a dilemma. Do we want to preserve the freedom of equality and these beliefs in America? If we do, we have to stand against socialism and communism and Nazism and political Islam. So this is an interesting study, and this is all in the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam in the United States. And hopefully we can pass to posterity the blessings of freedom.